Hira, good to see you. Thanks for making a bit of time to come and have a chat. I know that you're really busy at the moment because you were just talking about your moving house and the difficulties that's created. So thanks for making a bit of time. I wanted to kick off by asking you about something that you said to me when we spoke before. You said, just because we're connected globally doesn't mean that we necessarily click with people, which I thought was a really interesting statement. I'd never really kind of thought about kind of connecting with people and whether having a connection means that you've kind of clicked with them. It's a really interesting idea. I mean, why? Tell me why that's important to you, and what do you mean by that?
So first of all, good morning, Paul. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I think you raise a very important question, and if I recall, we also discussed this the last time we spoke. Well, look, I do agree that global connectivity has made it incredibly easy for us to access people, ideas, and cultures across the world. But access doesn't automatically translate into connection. Yes, we are more connected than ever in the digital sense. We can collaborate across time zones. We can build global teams. We can engage with perspectives that were once out of reach. But I personally believe that meaningful connection requires more than proximity or technology. It requires understanding, it requires curiosity and intention. So what I often see in my work, for example, is that people can sit in the same virtual room, work on the same
Yeah,
project, and
yeah.
still completely misunderstand each other.
And in terms of what you're trying to do, because you're trying to change that, aren't you? I mean, just tell us about what you're trying to do.
So for me, it's about how do we bring different cultural lenses and communication styles and assumptions into those interactions while being respectful of each other's work, right? We need to recognize and navigate those differences. Because if we don't do that, we risk reinforcing silos rather than breaking them down. So for me, I guess the real question isn't whether we are globally connected, it's whether we're culturally and emotionally connected. And that's where the intercultural intelligence and allyship becomes critical. And that's what I work on. Because at the heart of my work is a desire to shift mindsets from division to collaboration, from us versus them, to a genuine sense of we. For both myself and the organization I work with, the goal is to create environments where people don't feel like they have to compete for space or voice or opportunity based on their identity. Instead, they can contribute fully and authentically. And a big part of this is moving away from the idea that inclusion is the responsibility of a few. Whether that's HR diversity, HR heads, diversity leads, or it could be, marginalized groups themselves. I talk about allyship. I encourage people to recognize that we all have some form of privilege, whether that's linked to gender, ethnicity, seniority, education, or other social identity factors, and that we can use that privilege collectively to open doors for others. Because, I mean, for me, this matters because I believe that organizations thrive when people feel they belong. And when so that's why I feel like it's not enough to just be connected. People need to feel like they belong when they're part of a group. People need to feel psychologically safe and respected and heard. And collaboration improves, innovation increases, decision making becomes faster. So I think allyship and cultural intelligence is the main thing that I'm doing in my work to bridge that gap.
And you used the phrase cultural intelligence just then. I mean, just explore what that means because it sounds great. I'm not sure what that actually means in a practical sense. If I was running a business, what does that mean in a practical sense? And why is that so important? I mean, I get your point about allyship. That's about people working
Yeah,
together and
yeah.
helping each other. I mean, I get that. The cultural bit seems to me to be more complicated. I mean, just talk us through that.
Yes, so cultural intelligence is basically just the ability to be able to work with people from different backgrounds and cultures.
Right.
So I'll give you a very small example, Paul. I have lived in three different countries, right? And when I came to UK, I used to think, I'm very culturally savvy and I'm very culturally intelligent. And because I've lived in different cultures, I'm really good at what I do and understand people. But turns out not really, because I think I realized once I started doing more work on cultural intelligence, is that I was mainly coming from an ethnocentric perspective. So, this is one of
Right.
the key concepts I bring to my work. So, ethnocentrism is when we see our way of thinking or working as the default or the right way. And ethno-relativism, on the other hand, is about recognizing that there are multiple valid ways of doing things and being open to learning from them. So this is what cultural intelligence teaches us, basically moving from, I mean, in just simple words, moving from ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism, where you can thrive with people from different backgrounds and you learn to work with people who are different from you.
Okay, we'll come back to how you do that in a second. What was it that kind of set you on this particular path? I mean, I know you're also an
Mm.
author, but what particularly drew you to this area? I mean, personally, I mean, why has this become important for you?
Well, it became important for me is because I was seeing increasingly when I was doing my work on allyship that all of us, Paul, we come with preconceived notions and biases which we're not really aware of. So when we're approaching people, sometimes people are different than us, sometimes people are similar to us. We have very set ways of thinking that this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing. And when we approach things from that perspective, then that brings different, and difference of opinion is healthy, don't get me wrong. I like the fact that people are different, right? It's about how do we bridge those gaps to produce something effective, because if we are not understanding each other and if we're not giving space to each other in terms of doing things which are not necessarily the right way, but the way which will work for the project, then you're not really improving the productivity, are you? Because everybody thinks, okay, the way I'm doing it is the best way. But what if you get 4 or 5 other people, and so those people have very different ways, but effective ways of doing the same thing, which will save you money and time, right? So I guess for me, it was just recognizing that it is important to be able to overcome those biases and come from a place where we start, because all of us, when we see a cultural difference, we start minimizing it or dismissing it. But what we have to do is start being, and nobody's saying that you have to accept it and completely integrate it and forget your own culture. Nobody's obviously suggesting that. But once you become tolerant and we start seeing things from different people's perspective, I think your own mind map expands. And so does the scope of the work that you're working on. So that led me to do the cultural intelligence work, and get a proper certification in it.
Okay, and let me ask you about something that is not specifically about what you're doing, but kind of related to it. I mean, I get a sense that there is a lot of kind of anger and frustration in our society, certainly, I mean, the
Mm,
UK society at the moment, particularly since Brexit. Actually, it seems to have kind of got worse. There's a lot of anger, a lot of trolling on
mm,
social media and what have you, and a lot of kind of sort of cultural conflict. You know, that seems to me to be getting worse. Now, I mean, I don't have any evidence for that other than my own experiences. It seems to be getting. I'm just wondering, what's your take on why that's happening? Because it seems to me to be very, very negative, very unhelpful. And this is the point you made. I mean, it's pretty unproductive, really. Why do you feel that's happening at the moment? Do you have any particular insights into that?
I think the problem is that right now what we're doing is we're looking at obviously politics that is at play, and people spin narratives to suit
Yeah,
whatever works for
yeah,
them. So that's happening, of course, in the background, where people are made to blame and shame each other and say, okay, this is your fault if the economy is not
yeah.
doing well, or if I'm not earning well, or if I'm going through a cost of living crisis, it's the fault of the other people. And I think that's how, sadly, most political narratives work too, right? How do you turn people against each other? Um, I think it's important that we realize that we need to inculcate empathy, right? And we can only inculcate empathy if our leaders have that empathy. Because
Okay.
if our leaders are if the people who we listen to on a regular basis spread toxicity, then that's exactly what we are going to do as well, right? So I think actively listening, suspending judgment, being willing to see situations from different perspectives, um, is something which has become increasingly difficult, because we live in an
Yeah,
increasingly
yeah.
polarizing world where people think that, okay, it's us versus them. And we need more people to develop that empathy so that we can look at each other, not necessarily agree with each other. Yeah, but at
Mm.
least be accepting of the fact that there are people who are different from me, and they're not, and that's not necessarily a bad thing,
Yeah.
right? It's ultimately it's about creating cultures where people feel safe to contribute and challenge and grow. And I'm not saying that in a perfect society everybody's going to agree with each other's ways and of doing things. But yes, in a perfect society, people will have empathy and more tolerance. And there's this famous saying, Paul, which I grew up with, and I'm sure you've heard of this too. Do unto others as you would want to be
Yeah.
done to you. So you believe in this golden rule that you need to treat people the way you want to be treated. But now, after learning about cultural intelligence, I learned that that is actually a narrow way of seeing things. Because if you treat people the way you want to be treated, then you're actually assuming that there's a single reality, then everybody wants the
Yeah.
same thing. So the platinum rule is to start treating people the way they want to be treated rather than imposing what you want for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So I think it's those kind of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think your point about tolerance is actually really well made. I mean, I grew up believing that the UK was a very tolerant country. And I mean, it seems to have changed quite a lot, which is
Mm.
a bit of a loss, it seems to me. Let me come back to the business. I mean, so what you want to do is help people build up that empathy, that understanding
Mm.
of others, etc. So, and I know you work with big companies to help them do that. I mean, so in a practical sense, I mean, how do you do that? Because it's one thing to say, yeah, we all need to empathize with each other. It's another thing to change people's behavior. I mean, it's difficult enough to change people's
Yeah,
behavior around
yeah,
anything, isn't it? You're
yes.
talking about changing some quite complicated
Mm.
ways of doing, ways of thinking. I mean, just tell us about how you go about doing that, because that seems to me a very powerful thing if you can achieve that.
Yes, so Paul, I follow a very simple model. Because if I look at my book, the one which is behind her allies, my model is very simple. So you begin by challenging yourself. You recognize your own biases, your own shortcomings, your own limitations, because it's easy to challenge everybody else, but I mean, sorry, it's easier to challenge yourself than to challenge others, because you can only begin with yourself first before you start challenging, bigger things. So I always say challenge yourself first, begin with yourself. See, um, what is it that you can change? What is it that you can do differently? Am I making assumptions of people? Am I telling myself stories about people which are based on probably false narratives? So always begin by challenging yourself. And then I say you build the courage and then you start challenging others. And how do you start challenging others, especially if you talk about organizations? It's not about being angry or confrontational or, saying that, you're this, you're that. There's so many, and I have like a, plethora of ways in my book in which I tell people how do you gently challenge inappropriate behavior in organizations or, in the society, right? Be it through the use of humor, be it through the use of coaching, questioning, asking the right questions, so many different ways where you can actually say, well, you know what, this is not the right thing to do. And then you move on to challenge the organization culture and finally the institution. Now, usually people stop at culture because they're like, oh my God, challenging the institution sounds too big, which in hindsight is not, because, we all talk about global connectivity, right? We're connected on social media. We literally have access to any and everybody on this planet, right? And you can always participate in campaigns that will make a difference. You can share positive things. You can use social media for good, because a lot of times social media earns a bad reputation because it's toxic, it's this, it's that. And you can actually use it for good, and that's how you can eventually challenge institution by actually sharing about the good things, the moral things, the ethical things. So that is the model I follow. I believe that it's a progressive order. You begin by challenging yourself, and then you slowly muster the courage to start challenging others. You move on to the culture, and finally challenge the institution. I mean, you could actually start with the institution and come to yourself last, but I think it always helps
I
when you
mean,
work on yourself
it's the kind of
first.
Gandhi, be the change you want to see, isn't it? Kind of idea.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
And
yes.
it worked for India. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's probably
Yeah,
something.
and frankly, this is what we need, Paul, in this day and age, because it's just I feel like people are just very angry, they're frustrated, they're ready to blame people, and all this is not helping. Because it's
Mm.
not, right? Because if it was helping, or if it was improving our lives in any way, then I would say, okay, fine, but it's not.
Yeah.
So then what are better ways to go about it then?
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly agree with that. I mean, that's what the point I was making earlier on. You see so much anger on social media, and
Mm.
you think, well, it's not going to change anything. It's just people yelling at each other. which is pretty unproductive, really. Just to come back to the business thing, then. So you're working with big companies. You're trying to develop this kind of cultural intelligence, this allyship in big businesses. What does success like look to you? So let's say, for the sake of argument, 5 years down the road. I mean, what do you want to have achieved at that point? I mean, in terms of impact, in terms of change. I mean, give us a sense of where you're going with this.
So I think so. The one thing I would do want to say is that, all the things that I do, the work I do in terms of allyship, or be it intercultural intelligence or inclusion, I think we need to remember these are not one-off actions.
Mm.
They're ongoing practices. So if you are going to treat it as a one-off keynote or a one-off session, then obviously the impact is not going to be long-term, because you're going to say, okay, bring Hira in to give a 45-minute session on this particular topic. Everybody listens in. People are like, yes, this is great. They feel motivated. But for me, change doesn't come in unless there is top leadership involved, unless you solicit approval and endorsement from top leadership. So if it's a one-off thing, then I don't think so. Any of what I do is going to be successful. But if it becomes ongoing, like, they don't necessarily need to call me back to do things. But if they develop a culture, and whatever it is, I'm not just talking about my work. If change is to happen, change cannot happen by policies alone, right? Change happens when you start looking at, what do you tolerate, right? What do you ignore? What do you challenge? And that is something which requires hard work on a continuous basis. So for me, success would be where people take in the learnings but continuously evolve and bring in their own take on it. I mean, who's to say that you're only supposed to do what the consultant says? You can make changes as per what you think is fit for the organization, but this conversation needs to happen continuously rather than a one-off.
And have you
That's
got
when real change happens.
And have you got some good examples of organizations that are actually moving that agenda forward? Because it seems to me, I mean, your point about having the top leadership involved, that
Mm,
seems to be pretty sensible. Um, but it's not any, I mean, changing any organization is, I know
yes.
that, it's not
Yeah.
easy. Have you got examples of organizations perhaps that have really made progress around these issues?
Yeah, so I give you an example. I wouldn't necessarily name them for confidentiality reasons, but I launched an allyship initiative in an organization which did not really do well. Why? Because the top leadership wasn't involved.
Yeah.
It's only when they got the top person involved, that's when people started taking things seriously. That's when people were like, oh my God, okay, now, this is something we probably have to look into. We can't possibly ignore it for too long. And that's what got the commitment, because and what they did is, the other good thing the organization did was that instead of imposing any initiatives, they used to have a lot of coaching conversations with people, where they
Right.
used to solidify their personal why, tell them why is this important. So even like things like inclusion, right? So there is a business case for it. It brings more creativity, it fosters better teamwork, all of that, yes. But there is a thing known as sustainable collaborative advantage, that if you are able to work with people who are different from you, you're a catch. People would love to work with you.
Mm.
So focus on that personal why, and that's what the organization did, and that really made a difference. 2 weeks ago, I was actually at the Ministry of Defense doing a keynote, and one of the very, very top guys there was there. He wasn't there in person, but he came on camera, and he was so firm about his commitment of zero tolerance towards inappropriate behavior, because it was a women's leadership conference, towards sexism and inappropriate behavior. He sent a very clear message to everyone, and everybody in the room, like, different ranking officers, obviously, because of what he said, felt that they were obliged to listen, and even if they were not committed, but accountability matters. If accountability is not there,
Mm.
nothing changes. So when the top management is involved, when people feel there's accountability and they see the personal why and the benefit, that's when organizations improve.
Yeah. I mean, the military is a really good example because, I mean, they're not there yet, are they? I mean, it's good to hear that they're
Mhm.
committed to it. They're not necessarily there,
Mhm.
are they? I mean, they've still got their own problems, as
Yeah,
have most
yeah.
organizations. What would you want your legacy to be then? I mean, if success is about getting the people at the top of organizations to make a bigger commitment to this kind of work, what do you want your legacy to be?
Paul, it's funny you asked me this question because I was thinking when I started writing my books, when I started doing this work, and I used to tell my husband this, that even actually he's the one who told me this. It's like even if one person is positively impacted by the work that you do, that's enough. Your work is done. So when I wrote this book, my first book, I said even if one person finds it beneficial and decides to do things differently, my work is done as an author or, as a consultant or whoever. But obviously, lots more people than just one read the book and, they were challenged. They started thinking differently. And it was a ripple effect, right? So for me, obviously, my legacy is to say that, okay, she made us think differently. She made us think that, what I was thinking is not necessarily the only way to do things. And again, there is benefit in working collaboratively. Then there is benefit in allyship. There is benefit in being allies to each other, not just for me, but for generally the community. And I guess that's why I do the work I do, Paul. The writing I do. I write very long LinkedIn posts offering unsolicited advice on nearly everything. But my hope is that people and that happens, right? So many people reach out to me and say, just because of your post, we decided to do this, or we did this differently, or we thought about differently, or we self-reflected, and that's exactly what I want to achieve. That people to self-reflect and change things for good, for
Okay.
better.
Okay. So let me ask you about the journey, a bit about the journey that you've been on. So as you've been doing this, because I know you started a while back, it's not a new thing, is it? Um, have there been any particular surprises along the way that you've thought, oh, I really didn't think things would turn out like that?
Well, look, the kind of work that you do, what anybody does, is not easy, okay? And the work is not linear. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's discomfort, sometimes there's resistance. In fact, a lot of times there's resistance. When I launched my second book, Her Allies, I was met with a lot of resistance, right? But I think sometimes there's often a desire to get things right all the time, especially in conversations around inclusion. But what I've learned is that growth actually comes from getting things wrong, making mistakes, and being willing to learn from those moments. So I've had people who were naysayers who didn't quite agree with what I was saying, but after having those long conversations with them, having those thoughtful dialogues with them, eventually they could see what I'm trying to say to them. So I think patience is important. It's
Okay.
and it's and I think change is overrated because sometimes people think that if I'm going to do something, everybody is going to come on board and it's going to be dramatic. It doesn't happen like that. It happens very, very slowly. So I think you need to take it slowly. You need to give it the time it deserves. And vulnerability for me has been a big part of this journey because as a leader, I think it's very important being open about what you don't know, acknowledging mistakes, and then being willing to apologize when needed because that builds trust and it signals to others that it's okay to be human, to learn and to evolve. And for me, another thing is transparency is equally important because we used to think, oh, if we do something wrong in business or if something bad happens, then we need to cover it up, we need to hide it. But I think we really need to be clear about our intentions and our decisions and even challenges, even things that you do wrong, because people don't expect perfection, I think, but they do expect honesty.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and it's really important because that if you're not honest, it undermines your credibility, doesn't it? But let
Yeah.
me just ask you about the kind of because in effect you're campaigning, you've got a particular agenda that you want to move forward. I mean, I've spoken to quite a few people that are actively campaigning for one thing or another, and what they tell me is that it's a bit of a roller coaster. There's good days, there's
Mm.
days that don't go so well, and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you feel about having to ride that roller coaster? I mean, it's a tough gig. How do you
Yeah, it
feel?
is. It is. I know. Um, I remember when I wrote my second book, there was an interview I did, and one person said to me, "Why would you do this to yourself? You've opened a Pandora box telling
Yeah,
men what to
yeah.
do and writing an allyship book." And I said, "Well, look, because I believe in the good men in my life who have actually made a difference, and I believe essentially there are good people in this world who want to make a difference, and they just need a bit of guidance." So that is what motivates me. So yes, there are days when I get a lot of hate comments, probably on an article that I've written, and people will go around and say, "Oh, what you're saying is not true," and what is this rubbish you're saying? And some people actually even told me, "Oh, but what you're saying, half of it is not true." Even though now, 5 years down the road, especially in terms of allyship, a lot of things which I then discussed in terms of rape culture and all of that has now been substantiated with by a lot of facts. But I think it's just you need to understand your personal why, Paul, because this, like you said, it is a roller coaster ride. If you don't know what your personal why is, then it's very easy to disengage, let go of everything, lose hope, and say, I am not doing this anymore.
Mm.
But as long as your personal why is strong and you know that, eventually there will be more good out of it than bad, then
Mm.
I think you just keep going, the highs and lows.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, let me ask you about the positive side to that. I mean, what is it that you enjoy about this kind of work that you're doing and working with big companies to kind of change
I I
culture?
think the positive feedback is really very humbling, very flattering. So I went to the Ministry of Defense because I received excellent feedback on my talks before that 2 years ago, and actually it's I've been invited back every year in different parts of Ministry of Defense, but also Met Police and different organizations. And I think just the fact that it made a difference and people found the conversation to be impactful and they liked my style, I think that's very humbling. Or people always reach out to me on LinkedIn and say, we read your posts and they were great. So for the longest time when I wrote on LinkedIn, Paul, I didn't realize, I was like, do even people read the post? Does anything because at that time I didn't even have that many followers. Eventually, I started getting posts from people who probably had never even liked or commented, but still would read the post and
Right.
definitely had an impact on them. And then they reached out and they said, so I think all of that for me, it's very humbling. I'm very grateful.
And what about the reaction to the books? I mean, you've done a couple. I mean, how have people responded to those?
So great. I've had amazing reviews for my first book. And when you write a great first book, you're always scared about the next book you write. So allyship, the when I wrote Her Allies, I wouldn't lie, it did a lot of people resisted, fell off me, and they'll be like, oh, what have you written? All of that. So it was a difficult journey, but I think overall it has, received fabulous reviews. Every now and then I get some man who has read the book who tags me and says, oh, this was great. I learned a lot. So and Her Allies also, even though as hard as it was, got a lot of sort of coverage. I wrote a lot of it got published in many publications. I was interviewed in many newspapers. So yeah, I think overall the feedback is good. But I always say that obviously, as an author, as a writer, you cannot please people. I still remember I got a 2-star review on Her Allies because I wrote an article in the Mitch in where did I write the article? Was it the Independent? Yes, how men can be allies to women. So some very triggered person got triggered and said, "Oh, this book is nonsensical. It doesn't make sense." And I was like, "Really? Like 60,000 words? Not even a word made sense to you?" But of course, you'll get haters, right? You will get these 2-star or 1-star reviews. You just have to accept it and go on and focus on the positives.
Mm, mm. I mean, I've got three sisters, and I mean, you learn about those things as a child if you come from a family like mine. Let me ask you, so to come back to the success of the books and the success of the work you're doing with people like the Ministry of Defence, I mean, what would you say are the factors that underpin its success? Because I mean, what I quite like about it is it's quite challenging. Makes you sit up and think, oh, and it's good to see people being challenged in the Ministry of Defence, or in any government department, actually. What would you say are the factors that underpin its success? I mean, do you have a sense of that?
I think the language and the tone is really important for me. So I never approach these books in a way that would blame and shame people or accuse them of their privilege. So even when I do allyship work, I always start with a disclaimer that I'm not asking you to be ashamed of your privilege, or just because you're an ally, you're not expected to have all the answers or never make mistakes, because that's not practical. That's not human, right? And then I can go on to talk about my own privileges and how I feel like, despite the fact that, I'm a nation brown Muslim immigrant woman, I still have lots of privileges. And when I come from that conversation, I think people feel like they can be part of the conversation, because otherwise if I start the conversation by saying that this is wrong and this is what you need to do and you're the problem and you're this and you're that, conversation never really lands, sadly. So I think the way you approach certain difficult topics is important. You need to be able to um especially when you're starting off, you really need to make sure that you take people along with you rather than just say something dismissive in the beginning and you risk them shutting off on you completely, and then that's it.
Mm.
So I think the tone and the language and the way you approach it is really
Oh,
important.
and I was about to ask about the point you've just made about people switching off. I mean, big businesses have a lot of people in them. Inevitably, you're going to be some people that just aren't really open.
Yes, they
I
will
mean,
switch off.
how do you handle things like that? Because that seems to me to be the key. I mean, it's very easy to preach to the converted, isn't it? It
Yes.
it's the people that aren't the converts, if you like, that you've got to
Yeah.
win over, that you've got to get on your side.
Yeah.
But just talk me through how you go about that, because that seems to me to be the critical bit, winning over the
Yeah.
unconvinced, the skeptics, the people that resist it. I mean, just talk us through that because
So I'm going to
pretty
give
important.
you an example of this. That I did an allyship training. There's book launch in Pakistan, and I trained Pakistani police officers.
Right.
So I went, and there were about, I think, 200 people in the room. So initially, when I started the conversation, I think it didn't go quite as well because some of the people were like, "Oh yes, but I know." But women don't have it that bad, and it's fine, and it's whatever you're saying, it's not happening here. And then I was very sort of patient, and then I started sharing facts out of facts in a very calm manner. And I said, look, just because you don't know about it or women around you don't share it with you doesn't mean that it's not happening, right? Because we all live in a safety bubble. And once that bubble is burst and we start expanding our circle, we meet with people who are different than us and different opinions, that's when oh my God, the world isn't what I thought it was, right? So anyway, so there was this one person, one gentleman, if I can give you an example. In the beginning, he was the one who was challenging me quite a bit, and then he shut off, and I was like, okay, fine, this guy is switched off, and he's probably not going to interact with me again, and he probably thinks, what is she saying, and I don't want to hear.
Mm.
And after the presentation ended, he was very quiet. So I thought, I probably shouldn't even bother with this person. He doesn't like what I'm saying. He came up to me and he said, you know what, I just heard whatever you said. And I realized that, when I am talking to like criminals or when I'm talking to people at the police station, I'm using gendered abuse. So for example, like, I mean, I don't know how this podcast is, but I don't want to use those words necessarily on the podcast. But when you're abusing, a lot of them is, the mother, this sister, that, all of that. And the same, it happens in my language, in Urdu or in Hindi in India. So he said a lot of those I've noticed that this, and he said this is sexism, right? Because I don't say I am using a lot of sexist gendered abuse. And only when you said it, I realized that I'm doing that.
Mm.
So I'm going to now go and think about this and I'm not going to do it. Honestly, I had goosebumps. I was so emotional. And I was like, here's this person who I thought wasn't listening, had, was challenging me in the beginning and then completely shut off and was quiet, who started reflecting. And so for me, this was like the most memorable presentation I've ever done in my life. And of course, there will be some people who will never listen to what I say and they will always remain close. And I think this is something which you'll have to accept that you're not a cupcake, you're not going to make everyone happy. Or, I call it a plate of biryani. Like, in my country, everybody loves biryani. And he's like, you're not a plate of biryani. Not everybody's going to be happy with you. So it's the same, right? Whatever you say, not everybody is going to like it. Not everybody is going to agree with you. And that's okay. I think if the majority think, or even if half of them think, that what you're saying is making sense or doing something differently as a result of that, your job is done.
Yeah, yeah, very powerful stuff. Let me ask you about the flip side. I mean, you talked about making mistakes a second ago. I mean, what would you say is the biggest mistake you've made on the journey?
I mean, I think sometimes I'm not really aware of. So when I talk about allyship, and I've written a book on allyship, right? So sometimes I make mistakes, especially when I'm talking about marginalized communities that I do not represent, right? So in terms of pronouns, I've sometimes made mistakes, and I've called people, things which I mean, I've addressed them in the wrong way, right? Or even in terms of disability, there's certain things which I wasn't aware of and I didn't address it properly, or I didn't think of access as I should have thought of. And then later on, I was like, oh my God, this is something which I should have thought of. I've written a book on allyship. But the point to say is that we're all on a learning and evolving journey, Paul. So just because I've written this book doesn't mean I'm the expert. I am human. I'm going to make mistakes, but I think it's about how what you do after you've made the mistake. You acknowledge your responsibility and you plan to do better after that, because acknowledging your responsibility is one thing, but not planning to do anything after that, anything different, that's when the issues happen. So it's about how quickly you can move on from there and do something better.
Yeah, and just to pick up the point you made about taking responsibility for mistakes and doing better. I mean, Do you see, I mean, people like the Ministry of Defence, as a for instance? I mean, are they taking these things seriously? Are they, you know, I mean, it's great to come and talk to them. It's great when people respond positively.
Mm.
Are you seeing change over time? I mean, are they, is there evidence that it's having the right kind of impact?
I would hope so. It's too early because I just did the talk 2 weeks ago, but I'll give you a very small example. One of the people there in that room, because I was saying, in the talk, I was saying sometimes we're so used to seeing things in a way. We often develop tunnel vision, right? Because we're used to seeing things in a certain way. We don't look at things differently. And I was giving an example of a talk I did in a very posh club in London some time back when I asked women, and I'm talking about women in the room, not even men, to notice what's different in the room, and none of them could point out that the paintings that were hanging on the wall, they were all men. There's not
All
a
right.
single painting of a woman there, which no one seemed to notice because they were so used to seeing these paintings around. So I noticed, and I shared this in the conversation. So one person who was there in the audience, he said, "I want to show you something," and he took me to a room and he said, "Look around you," and he said, "I would never have noticed this until you shared your example. Look at these pictures; they're all men." There are no women in the pictures. And I was like, oh, wow. So if my talk is really working. And he's like, it is because, I'm now looking at things differently. So it's just a very small example of, where I don't know, like in the law, I'm hoping that every time he would go into these different rooms, he's going to notice the difference because sometimes you just need one light bulb moment and then that's it, right? And then you just become aware for life, I would say. Maybe if that's not an exaggeration. So I think sometimes it's not grand gestures, Paul. Sometimes it's these tiny changes in your
I
everyday
mean,
behaviors which make a
yeah,
difference.
I was sort of, what was behind my question was whether you sort of work with them to deliver an action plan to achieve the sorts of changes they're looking to achieve. I mean,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, so basically, so obviously, the once you do the talk, because their theme has been culture change, and then once you do the talk, then there is a follow-up thing to do, which where you see how much of it has actually been translated into actionable impact, because intentions are all great, but
Mm.
unless those intentions are translated into actionable impact, everything else is futile. But then that will happen over the course of time, right? So we yet to see, we're yet to see, but I'm hopeful. Let's see.
Yeah. You've got to be optimistic, haven't you? And if you were, if you look back on the journey, I mean, if you were starting again, is there anything you'd do differently?
I'm just trying to think, not really, Paul, because I think the successes, the failures, the mistakes, they made me who I am. Um, So yes, there were probably certain aspects, if I knew it back then, I probably wouldn't have to work so hard on it, like writing a book, but then you would have to do the research anyway. So I do believe there's certain processes, there's certain phases in life that you're meant to go through or certain challenges to be the person you are. So I mean, I would say, yeah, there's not much I would change, to be honest.
Okay. And if you
I
were
mean, if
to,
I could I could probably get the right mentors earlier on. I mean, that would be very helpful to get the right people who could
right,
support you with the right stuff. I think that's
yeah.
important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great piece of advice. I mean, surround yourself with smart people and get the people that will help you and support you. That's always a good idea, it seems to
Mm. Mm.
mentor or other peers, you know, good things. Let me ask you one last question before I run. If you were to give some advice to somebody starting out on a journey like yours, I mean, which is really, writing a book, building a consultancy business, working with big companies. I mean, what advice would you give to somebody who was starting out on that journey?
I think what I would say is, to be honest, don't wait for the perfect time, right? Don't
Mm.
wait for, so because sometimes you wait for too long for things to happen, right? Um, I think just go for it. You will experience failures, you will experience challenges, but make sure that you have a strong support system around you. I always say this, allies need allies too. So make sure that you have the right support around you who could get you to the places that you want to go. Prioritize your own health and take care of your own mental and physical health because nobody else is going to do that for
And if you
you,
don't look after
right?
yourself, you
You
can't
will
help anyone else, can you?
Absolutely. So do that. And then I guess just go for it. I mean, go for things that you really want to go for because you know, you don't know what's on the other side. I mean, yes, you might fail, but what if you succeed,
Yeah.
right? And if you even if you do fail, you can always try again.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's that famous quote from Winston Churchill. He said, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It's the courage to
Mm,
continue that matters. And I think it's a very well made point.
absolutely.
It's about sticking at it, isn't it? If you really
I
believe
love
it.
that. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Hira, thank you for making a bit of time to come and have a chat. I mean, it's really interesting area that you're in, and I think probably pretty important for organization, well, for certainly organizations like the Ministry of Defence, but lots of other organizations as well, to kind of begin to tackle some of these issues because they're not easy. If they were easy to fix these things, they'd have been fixed, wouldn't they? So it's good to see that people are engaging with what are quite difficult challenges, really. So thanks for taking a bit of time to come and tell us about it. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure speaking to you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
Cheers, Hira. Bye bye.